Did you have something funny to say to start off with, or what?
No, this is a serious episode. Welcome back to an all-new episode of the D3 Datacast. Back again. I'm Zach Snyder with Matt Snyder, and today we're going to go through different types of rankings that you might see as you're checking the D3 hoops landscape. Some of these we've already mentioned in previous episodes, kind of in passing, but we wanted to take a dedicated episode to go through the different types of rankings that we'll continually mention and you'll be often seeing during a D3 hoop season. So with that, I think we'll just jump right in. Matt, we want to start off with probably the one that most people would be familiar with, and that's the D3hoops.com top 25 poll.
Yeah. So as we talk about D3 hoops, like you said, we often talk about all these different types of rankings, and sometimes they can get confusing. Sometimes we can conflate them with each other. But yes, starting off with the first one is the main one, the grandfather of all rankings in D3 hoops is D3hoops.com top 25. Definitely D3hoops.com is the reputable publication here when you're talking about Division III basketball and rankings. Every now and then you see another poll out there, but it doesn't seem like it's going to match in the quality of the D3hoops.com top 25. So definitely always check this one out. But when you're talking about a top 25 poll, this is one of the types of rankings we're looking at. You know, who's number one, who's number two. This is what we think about in rankings. And this is voted on by people, group of voters, media members, coaches around the country. So it's important to keep in mind what they're thinking about when they're voting on a top 25. And that's kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about is, Zach, how do you see a top 25? What do you think about when you see these rankings as far as like the ordinal list of teams 1 through 25? What does that represent to you, and what do you think it represents to voters?
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about a top 25 is probably each voter approaches it a little bit differently. Um, in the preseason, that can be difficult, especially at this level where maybe we're not always sure who's returning, what kind of a recruiting class a team has coming in. It's not like the Division I level where you have star rankings and these big expectations for the quality level of incoming talent. Um, but yeah, I think at the beginning of the season, it's just a list of who do I think are the top 25 best teams. And then as the season moves on, maybe it morphs into a little bit of a mix of which teams do I think are good, which teams have shown that they're good, which teams have maybe shown they're not quite as good as expectations. And then, at the end of the season, probably again, it goes just to an individual's opinion on what are the 25 best teams once,
Mhm.
the full season's played out.
Yeah, you talked about the 25 best teams kind of in order there, and that's how I think of it too. But pretty quickly, when you think about best teams, that idea can kind of break down. Best teams as far as who's going to win on a neutral site tournament. Like I think number one's always going to beat number two, is always going to beat number three. Well, not always, but generally speaking, right? There's always randomness in games. Or is it best teams as in most deserving champion, right? Because that's a different thing too. Um, you could have a team who you maybe think wouldn't win the next matchup, or you wouldn't project to win the next matchup, but they have a result or two that you think should propel them. They deserve to be there, not necessarily their quote unquote the best. So I think these are things that voters have to weigh, and maybe that morphs, like you said, as the season goes on, from who do I think are the best to maybe something more along the lines of who's most like a champion. I don't think you'd get into a situation where the national champion isn't voted number one. I'm not sure if that's happened before or not. But we've seen, teams voted number two who's not necessarily the runner up. So I think there's some combination there. But I think maybe what's a plus and what's a minus if we think about strengths and weaknesses of some of these different rating systems. As you said, a top 25 voted by people, they can really quickly assess an injury to a team. They might discount a loss if they had some of their top players out for a game. They might be quick to adjust for a player returning or, like you said, transfers at the beginning of the season. You could a person could very easily account for that in their rankings and adjust quickly if that seems to be working out or not working out. Um,
Right. Right.
and
I think
yeah, go ahead.
I was just say I think another strength of the top 25, even though really as the season plays out, it has no bearing on anything, right? It doesn't
Yep.
determine anything for the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
This is kind of just for entertainment purposes only
Yep.
um uh thing. But I think one of the pluses is that this is a really accessible way for fans to kind of see who at least a collection of voters think are the top 25 teams, and for all the ways that things happen in Division 3 that are not like the Division 1 level. This is one level or one way that things are like the Division 1 level. You got a top 25 for Division 3, just like you see a top 25 for Division 1. So I think it's very familiar and accessible, um, based on, what we see at the higher levels, that people are used to seeing.
Yeah, and we can get in our bubbles of our region or our conference that we particularly follow. And this is kind of a national pulse. I think the D3 Hoops crew does a good job of allocating voters as best as they can around the country. So it's not just focused on one area or the other. And I know we can get focused on our region or neighboring regions and sometimes lose sight of the national picture. Um, but I think that's also another key here is it's kind of a national pulse of what's the conversation like in Division 3 and who's seen as strong across the country. And I like that comparison to Division 1. We're in Division 1 football season right now, so you have that um, top 25 ranking. Important to note though that Division 3 basketball has over 420 teams, so you're not ranking the same percentage of teams. To get in the top 25 is you have to be an elite team. You can't just be merely good. So I think you see some conversation of, hey, this team's good. Why aren't they in the top 25? Um, any team that's in the top 50 is good. So I think that's something to keep in mind here. While we're talking about voters and votes, I just wanted to highlight some maybe people to follow. I don't know what the voter rolls are like currently, if they change over from year to year, but I know last year these are people you can see on the screen here: Ryan Scott, Bob Quillman, Akiva Poppers, Coach Mike Rainiak, Dave McHugh of Hoopsville, Ryan Whitnable. They have outed themselves as voters. I don't think d3hoops.com tells us who the voters are, but individuals are allowed to tell us that they're voters. And these folks have voted in the past and have often posted their ballots on a weekly basis on social media, such as twitter.com, and have invited some level of interaction, right? Hopefully that's positive discourse, not just trash people feed their way. But these are great people to follow during the season. I'm assuming that they're voting again. If they're not, they can correct us or whatnot. But definitely good people to follow as far as seeing the thought process play out, or at least seeing how they're voting. It's kind of interesting to see some of the wild differences. Someone might have a team in the top 5. Someone might have them struggling to hit the top 20. And it's kind of interesting to see maybe why those reasons are. And it's some of the things we've called out. Maybe it's an injury. Maybe it's a star player. Maybe it's a wait and see approach because they haven't played anyone yet. But that's always interesting to see.
Right. We do know that it's a list of 25 voters, and you can see that in the point totals published along with each top 25. Every first place vote is worth 25 points. So you have a maximum point total of 625, 25 times 25. Yeah, but I don't think d3hoops.com has published the full list of who those 25 are, but like you said, a few of them have made their ballots public, which is cool to see.
Mm-hmm. And always important to note, because more teams get votes than are in the top 25, there's the others receiving votes category. The team that has received the 26th most points in the poll is not the number 26 team in the country. And don't say they are, or else Pat Coleman of d3hoops.com will come and find you, and he will not be happy with you. Anything else you have to think you thinking about the top 25?
No, I think it's just I think a lot of the criticisms or comments that you can get from fans are very similar to what you might see in response to a Division I poll. Sometimes there's expectations, Team B beat Team A, so Team B needs to be ranked above Team A. But there's a lot of
Yeah,
different inputs that can go into a final decision.
yeah,
But
and you can get into circular reasoning that way. A beat C beat A. I didn't say that right, but you know what I mean.
right.
Um, and it's important to know this has no bearing on NCAA tournament selections. You called that out earlier, but this is not trying to do the same thing as who's in the tournament or who's a number one seed in the tournament or hosting pods. This is a different conversation entirely. We'll get to that later. All right, so the next type of ranking we want to talk about near and dear to our hearts here at the D3 Datacast, and it's computer rankings. We're fortunate to have a couple of computer rankings that exist in the Division III sphere. I love them. I think they're I can maybe rely on them too much sometimes myself personally, but the Massey ratings, MasseyRatings.com, were developed by Ken Massey, and he is great. More sports than just basketball and football. Like you can get Division III volleyball rankings on his site. I think high school football, I think he has on his site. You can get a lot of different things. So great job by him. And it's fun that Division III basketball is included. And then I also run efficiency-based ratings, and I post them on my blog site. And we'll have the links to all these things and to the Twitter accounts we mentioned before in the show description below. But these computer rankings, in some ways, are similar to the top 25 in that it's trying to assess maybe who are the best teams, but it's done in a different way, right? We talked about the human element of the top 25 rankings before. These kind of intentionally strip that out, right? There's no eye test involved here. There's no watch the games. It's just taking data inputs from box scores, right? Like the Massey ratings just looks at the date the game was played, each team's score, and the location, and computes kind of a team strength based on that. My efficiency ratings take into account um, the score, the location, and a calculated number of possessions from the box score, and makes a team assessment based on that. And there's strengths and weaknesses to that. Right? One strength is we're not going to see the same level of bias, intentional or not, toward certain teams. You might come into a season with an expectation of a certain team being high, uh, but the computers doesn't see teams. It doesn't know that a school is supposed to be strong or not supposed to be strong. It just sees what the results are. So you'll get some of that bias stripped out. Some of the minuses of the computer ratings is these are both simple systems, and like you said, we're not going to be able to adjust for maybe a star player was missing from a game. A computer system could adjust for that, but like we said, there's 420 some odd Division III teams, and you can't. You'd have a full-time job just managing who was in, who was out for games, who played, who didn't play. And so I don't think there's really any system that would try to do that for Division III, at least at this time.
The way that you could do that, which I don't actually remember if Massey does or not, is weight more recent results heavier than early season. I know when we did the episode about the preseason efficiency ratings, we talked about at about the 10 game point, this season's efficiency ratings will be solely based on this season's results. However, at the end of the year, you'll still have equal weighting between early season results and late season results. And I'm not sure if
Yeah.
Massey does that, but a computer ranking could weight more recent results heavier than early season results. That would capture maybe a net increase or decrease in performance based on something like a lineup change or an injury situation.
Yeah, it's been a little while since I've done a full deep dive on the Massey method, but I believe there is some sort of recency. So by the time you get to the end of the season, in March, let's say, November's results are weighted a little bit less. I believe he does incorporate that in his system, which is perfectly great, reasonable. My system does not do that. So it's just important to know that there's a difference between those two. Another thing that Massey does that I do not do in my efficiency ratings is Massey will do a little correction on the result to give credit for the team that won. I think that makes some sense to do that. I don't necessarily. So an example is if you and I are playing a game and we're playing at your home stadium and you beat me by 1 point, Massey's going to correct to make sure that you come out as a little bit stronger, I believe. It'll be very close since it was a close game, but you were stronger for that game. My system might say that I was a little bit stronger because I was disadvantaged by being on the road and lost a close game. So I don't do a correction for actual wins and losses. Just important to note the difference. Mine is just looking at kind of raw performance. So in that way, mine might be a little bit more forward-looking than Massey, but I think that difference there is a little bit slight.
Yeah, and even between the computer rankings with the screenshot you have here, you can see some similarities in kind of the final result.
Yeah, this is Massey's final result, and then my projections coming into the year. So a little bit different data set here, but a lot of similarities covered.
Right. But the preseason going to be heavily influenced by the most recent previous season.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So the top 3 teams are the same, and then there's differences. Again, we're not looking at exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Oh, one more thing I want to say about Massey is beyond just rankings, he's got some pretty cool tools built into his site that you can look at predictions for future games, and then also you can manipulate some of those matchups to plug in any college team. So you could see what a Division III team might be expected to do against a Division I team, or even between Division III teams that maybe aren't meeting, or you might expect as a future tournament matchup. You can plug that in and then also change where the game is played or a neutral site. So there's a lot of cool stuff that he has built in that take advantage of his ratings. So it's kind of a fun site to play around with and click around and see what he has. He's got a lot of good write-ups on explaining some of his system. So it's not just a black box that spits out a result, but he does a pretty good job of explaining his methods without giving up too many of his secrets. And then also with some pretty cool tools that use the ratings and the way that teams are expected to how they're expected to play, and letting you kind of play around with that to create your own matchups. So pretty cool, worth clicking around, especially if you're not familiar with the Massey ratings. It's a good way to get more familiar with it and learn what he's got there.
Yeah, another fun thing is his transitive path tool that you can pick almost any team in Division III or NAIA or whatever, and say how does Calvin beat Duke, and it says a team beat a team, beat a team, beat a team, beat a team, and you have like 30 games where you beat someone who beat someone who beat someone who beat the Duke Blue Devils or something like that. So you can have fun with that. It's only for entertainment. It's not any
Right.
sort of predictive value there, but it's just kind of fun to look.
If I'm remembering correctly, back a ways, like I think Gardner Webb beat Duke in an early season matchup, and then but before that, I don't know if it was an exhibition game or whatever. I think a Division III team, I don't remember who it was, had beaten Gardner Webb. And so yeah, there was kind of a fun transitive path there all the way to Duke. So yeah, it's worth playing around with some of the tools he has on there. And also wanted to mention my background from today. Since this wasn't really school or conference specific, I did a random number generator just to pick a school off of the final Massey ratings from last year. It came out to 375. So 375 in the final Massey ratings from last year was Dean College out of the GNAC. So we've got their gymnasium behind. So shout out to Dean College.
The GNAC's growing bigger. There's some conference changes going on in that conference.
Yes.
All right. So moving on, our final type of rankings is the most important come the end of the year in many ways. And this is the regional rankings that the NCAA puts out. It's also the same type of ranking format that's used for the Pool C selections. Those are the at-large bids into the NCAA tournament. But our show will definitely be probably pivoting to talking about those heavily come February. We get, I think, 3 or 4 sets of regional rankings leading up to the end of the season. And it's always important to know, as we talked about this in the top 25, these are asking very different questions from each other. A top 25 voter is not trying to say who's most deserving of the NCAA tournament. The NCAA is not even necessarily saying who do we think are the top teams in the country in order. They're setting up. Here the NCAA, you can see on the screen, is setting up 5 primary criteria for ranking teams in the regional rankings. Some of these things might have overlap on things that a voter is going to be looking for, but they're not all the same, and they won't all be weighted the same. So these regional committees and national committees, when they're doing their calls, setting up each of the 10 regions, ranking them in order, they're doing it against these 5 primary criteria, which are your win-loss percentage in Division Three, any head-to-head competition you might have against another team in those rankings, results versus common opponents that you might have versus those other teams vying for those same spots in the rankings, um, results versus regionally ranked teams in any region. Those weigh heavily. Also, your Division Three strength of schedule, and it's important to note Division Three strength of schedule as calculated by the NCAA. That might be different than a voter sees as a strength of schedule, or different than the computers see as strength of schedule. The NCAA has a specific formula they're using. So when we get toward the end of the season and we're talking about regional rankings, we're talking about Pool C selections, we should note that the Massey ratings and regional rankings, they're not the same thing. They're not trying to hit the same order necessarily. Top 25 voter, regional rankings, regional advisory committee, they're not necessarily trying to hit the same teams for the same reasons. These are very different things, and they have different criterion that they're going off of. If you're talking about the NCAA selection process, the regional rankings, we have to go against these criteria that are on the screen. This is what's published in the NCAA, pre-championship manual for Division III basketball. This is what they use, and they're weighing these criteria against each other, not anything else.
Right. So actually, I look at this. I know the regional ranking process can get knocked from time to time. Now, this process isn't perfect, although it's better than what we've seen at other times in Division III basketball history. But I actually look at this as a little bit of a blend of the first two that we talked about, because there's some objective criteria, winning percentage, strength of schedule, as they choose to calculate it or define it, and then a little bit of subjectivity as the regional ranking committees take those and decide how they want to weight and rank. But of course, instead of ranking nationwide, it's just limited to teams within a region.
Yeah, and the NCAA doesn't prescribe how you weight these things against each other. So that's kind of up to the committee a little bit. I think they've said they give them equal weight for whatever that means, but they have to decide, when you're looking at results versus regionally ranked opponents, if your 5 wins and 2 losses are your 5 wins against highly ranked opponents in your region or in other regions, or are they against lowly ranked teams? And those committee members are making those decisions more like a human voter would. They are human voters. But the data would be calculated as a computer might do that. So I think that's what you're saying. There's the combination of the two. But I think it's, to be clear, they're not a combination of the two as far as what they're trying to assess necessarily. Very easy classic example that is continually joked about online from last year is throughout most of the year, the Max from Yeshiva were in the top 25, in the top 5. They're ranked number 1 for a while. But at no point in the year were they really a serious at-large bid Pool C contender, because their criteria, according to these 5 bullet points, wasn't there. They didn't play a strong schedule. They didn't have many games against regionally ranked opponents. So a voter could look and say, hey, they're playing in the Skyline. Yes, that's not a good conference. They don't have a high strength of schedule, but they're kicking the snot out of most of these teams. A voter could say, I think they're one of the best teams in Division III. The NCAA, the committee members are not allowed to say that. Their margin of victory is not on the list. They're not allowed to look at that. They're only allowed to look at, did they win or lose, and what's their calculated strength of schedule. So that's a team who might be in top 25 consideration, but is not in consideration for the tournament if they lose their conference tournament and don't get that automatic bid. So there's several teams like that every year. Teams that they wouldn't be in top 25 consideration, but because of how the math works out, hey, they might be an at-large bid consideration for the tournament. So just always important to note, different questions are being asked and you're coming up with different answers.
Right. So you want to avoid asking the question, oh, why is this team ranked high in the top 25, but they're behind this team or these teams in the regional rankings?
Yep.
And the answer is because they don't have anything to do with each other.
Yeah.
They're looking at different sets of criteria. They're answering different questions, for better or worse. They're not necessarily one's better than the other. They're just different.
Yeah. they're asking different questions. They're coming up with different answers. They're using different criteria to come up with those answers. So there's going to be a lot of overlap. If UW Oshkosh is number 1 or 2 and Randolph Macon's number 1 or 2, they're probably going to be high in the region just naturally. But that's not, by definition, they're not going to be 1-1 or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of the end of what we were gonna talk about. And we talked a lot about comparing these. Well, not necessarily direct comparisons, but just talking about what each one are, what they're good for. In my mind, the computer rankings and the top 25 are the most similar, and regional rankings are completely different. In many ways, the computers and the top 25 voters are trying to answer largely the same questions. It might not be the exact same questions, but it's pretty much, who do we think are the best 25 teams in order in Division Three, and they're approaching those from different ways. And I kind of scoff sometimes when they don't line up. Like, hey, why do you have this team number 25 when they're clearly one of the 10 best teams by the computer metrics? But I think in actuality, it's those differences that make the questions interesting, and that's where we can have the conversations about, hey, why do voters maybe see this team lower than the computers? Do we think there's something predictive there that the voters are seeing or that the computers are seeing? And that's maybe some of the interesting, week to week things to watch.
Yep. And that's why we wanted to go through this, because they are each out there. They have their use. As a Division III basketball fan, you really can't avoid any of these three, nor should you. They each have their place. They are relevant. And we've already referenced, some of the Massey ratings and efficiency ratings in previous episodes, and that's going to continue, through the season, especially as we get into regional ranking time even more. So just wanted to take this episode to maybe add some context to some things that we've already referenced in earlier episodes and that will continue to be referenced throughout the season. I think it's pretty common to reference, so-and-so is a top 25 team, and that really goes to their consideration for a d3hoops.com top 25, or as you're looking at rankings or how teams stack up outside of a top 25, that's what computer rankings are really great for, because they're ranking the entire division. And then ultimately we get to regional ranking time, and that's what's going to set the stage for who the real contenders are for filling out the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, to be honest, it was really jarring for me to make that pivot last year. From early on in the year, I was really focused on doing my computer rankings, following those teams top 25, and then toward the end of the season, I get really involved in the Pool C picture, the regional rankings picture, and then I was so heavily involved in regional rankings and who's the best teams according to the NCAA. Even ending up on the selection show, the mock selection show with Hoopsville. Being on their panel there as we selected the teams. And then I went to go fill out my bracket based on my efficiency ratings. And, there's a team that's a no doubt Pool C contender, but then you look at their numbers and you think, hey, this team's actually, maybe destined to lose in the first or second round. They're not that good. And in scare quotes, right? Not that good. You have to be good to be playing in March. But it's just, they can be that different. It can be completely jarring to go from one to the other and say who's quote unquote good by this system, or who's quote unquote good by the top 25 or the computer rankings. Could be very different.
Right. And then you mentioned Yeshiva earlier. Not really in consideration for an at-large bid. Now, of course, they won the auto bid from the Skyline, so that wasn't a consideration. But then you kind of switch gears and look at that pod they were in, and they played a really good game and got bounced, but they were real contenders to come out of that first pod.
Yeah. You look at that pod, and I think it was it Stockton, Hopkins, and Yeshiva were in that pod, and Yeshiva was probably the 3. But then if you look at it by the numbers, those 3 teams are quite even. That's why it's important to know that there's a difference between those things, and why you get those matchups sometimes in March in a very strong pod like that.
Yeah, so I think that wraps it up for today's episode. Thanks for joining us again. If you haven't clicked subscribe here on YouTube, please do. We're really trying to get to 100, because that lets us customize our URL, so we could tell people just to go to youtube.com/D3Datacast instead of whatever YouTube gives you by default, youtube.com/channel/random string of characters, which I have no idea what it is for us right now. So anyway, there is a practical reason why we're really trying to drive those first 100 subscribers. So if you haven't clicked that subscribe button yet, please do. Leave us a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Let us know your thoughts on different rankings, maybe how you use them as a Division III fan. And yeah, I don't know, Matt, any closing thoughts?
I was just really excited to see if you were going to go with Datacast or Datacast at the beginning of the episode. Excited to know that you went with Datacast this week. So hopefully we'll use that going forward.
Yeah, I think I used both last week, and
Mhm.
then also maybe a third that was kind of a slur between the two. So yeah, we're going Datacast.
Yeah, let's do that.
I just have to think about it ahead of time before I say it. Eventually, it'll become second nature. So, anyway, that wraps it up. Thanks for joining us. You can also find us on Twitter at D3Datacast. Please follow us there and let us know you watched the video, and we'd love to give you a follow back.
Good job, team.